Good morning, everyone. Beautiful autumn morning out here. The colors are going quickly, but it has been such a wonderful, just beautiful autumn out here so far. I'm absolutely loving it. This morning, I wanted to talk about one of the more difficult parts of wildlife photography. That is actually finding wildlife to photograph. This is something that I've touched on previously in some other videos before, just briefly here and there, but I wanted to dedicate a little bit more time into some of the methods that I use most to find wildlife to photograph. I'll start with the more basic methods that I use and get a little bit more advanced with each method. So follow along today as I discuss some of my favorite methods and ways that I get out there to find wildlife to photograph. The first method, and by far the most simple method of finding wildlife that I like to use, is just with my own eyes or with a pair of binoculars or a spotting scope. It's commonly referred to as glassing if you're using a pair of binoculars or a spotting scope. This is something that anybody can do as long as you've got a pair of binoculars or a spotting scope. You'll be able to find wildlife this way. Again, even if you don't have binoculars, you can just use your bare eyes to do this. So across from me here, I've got this gradual mountain slope, this hillside essentially, just gradually going up, and it's landscape like this where I really like to use this method because you're able to see a lot of terrain at once. And you know, there's no method to the madness here. There's no set way of doing this. Everybody has their own preferred way. The way that I like to find wildlife this way is before I ever use my binoculars, is I'll just use my eyes to look over the landscape, get more of a wider angle of view here. And I'm just looking for movement first of all, and then I'll go over the landscape again and look for any stationary objects that may be there. Even if you have a well camouflaged subject that you're looking for, if they're moving, your eyes will pick that out really quickly. So that's why I start looking for movement first. And I'll just go over the landscape here without my binoculars first. And I'm just doing this really quickly for the sake of this video. I'm not seeing anything well without the binoculars. So what I'm going to do now with the binoculars, again, there's no set way of doing this. This is just how I do it. I start at the top left corner, and what I'm going to do with the binoculars is I'm going to move up and down, left to right. So as I look through the binoculars, I'll start at the top left corner of the hillside here. I'll move down and then back up and down and back up, all the while moving from left to right. If I don't see anything that way, I'll go back up to that corner, and then I'll move from left to right, progressively moving down. So again, no set pattern here, but this is the way that I like to glass a hillside or a field, if I've got a tall vantage point, something like that, if I'm using binoculars or a spotting scope, or if I'm just using my eyes. This is a way that I like to look over a landscape, all the while again looking for movement, looking for anything that may stand out a little bit. And then once you find an animal or multiple animals, you can then decide how you want to go about photographing that animal. Again, the most simple way of finding wildlife, something that anybody can do. This is a method that I use to find a lot of the hoofed mammals, the ungulate species that I photographed, whether it's mule deer or moose or bighorn sheep, species like that. I really like to use this method to photograph as they go about grazing. It's easy to pick them out of a landscape using this method. Something else that I like to remember when using this method, and all the methods that we're going to talk about today, is to go where the wildlife are. If you just choose a random hill somewhere, you might find some wildlife using this method or the other methods that we talk about. But if you're able to go there beforehand and identify certain features in that landscape that will draw wildlife there, you'll have a better chance of finding the wildlife. Now I'll go into this a little bit more further on in this video, so we'll come back to this point. All right, let's talk about another method that I really like to utilize to help me find wildlife when I'm out in nature. That is the use of trail cameras. I use trail cameras a lot to aid me in my photography. Now notice I said to aid in my photography and not for my photography. So What I mean by that is I don't actually use the content that I get from trail cameras, the videos and the photos. I don't post that stuff here on YouTube or on my other platforms. I don't print the images, anything like that. I essentially just use trail cameras to aid me in my photography. You know, I'm only one person. I can only be in one place at a time, looking through one landscape at a time for wildlife. Trail cameras are an excellent way to essentially duplicate yourself, to make it so you can be in more than one place at a time when looking for wildlife. I use trail cameras a lot because it helps me see what's in an area when I'm not actually there. So a few things to keep in mind when using trail cameras is, first of all, make sure you're in an area where you actually can use a trail camera. National parks, for example, you cannot use trail cameras there. So know before you set it up that you're actually in an area where you can use trail cameras. The next thing, kind of like we talked about with the binoculars, is you want to make sure you're setting it up in an area where you're actually going to see wildlife. You know, with the binoculars, you don't just go out and pick some random, you know, open patch of ground somewhere and start looking. You can do that, but you probably won't see as much wildlife as you would if you picked a hillside with a lot of game trails running through it, something like that. Similarly, with trail cameras, you want to make sure you're setting them up in an area that you know is frequented by wildlife, whether that's a game trail in the forest or an area like this. So this may on video look like a cave. It's actually not a cave. This is a natural corridor through the rock wall here that leads to the other side of the mountain here, which is really cool. So this natural corridor is the perfect place to set up a trail camera. It's a natural funnel through the mountain, basically. And so I'm going to set a trail camera up here and be able to get a picture of whatever is coming through this natural corridor. The next thing you want to keep in mind when using a trail camera is, I've got this tree here behind me, I've got grass down here. If I were to set up the trail camera right here to hopefully get anything coming through this corridor, anytime wind comes through and starts blowing this tree around or the grass, the sensor is going to trigger the camera to start taking pictures. And when I check the pictures, I'm going to have hundreds of pictures of grass blowing around, which is not what I want. So instead of pointing the camera this way, I'm just going to turn it a little bit and point it at this corridor so I can get any movement coming through the corridor without getting the wind blowing the trees and the grass and everything. Next thing to keep in mind is you may see this little antenna on the trail camera. Now I use a variety of different types of trail cameras. Most trail cameras they simply take pictures and then you go get that camera later, get the memory card, check the pictures that it took on your laptop, whatever. This trail camera actually sends pictures directly to my cell phone. As soon as it takes a picture, it sends me a notification on my phone, shows me what it is as soon as it takes that picture. The reason I'm using a more pricey trail camera like this in this area is because it was extremely difficult to get up here this morning, and I don't want to be coming up here every 3 or 4 days, especially if nothing's even coming through the area. So I'm going to use this trail camera that will send me a picture anytime it takes one, and that way I can know before I hike all the way up here that something's actually using this area. So those are just a few things to keep in mind when using trail cameras. I absolutely love trail cameras. I use them all the time, again, to aid in my photography, and I highly recommend that it's something you look into when looking for wildlife. On that note, I'm going to get this set up. I've got 4 others, I believe, I need to set up today. So I'm going to get this set up, move on to the next one, and keep going. The next method of finding wildlife that I wanted to talk about today is by actually tracking animals. Now, when I talk about tracking, I'm not simply just saying find footprints and follow them. There are so many other ways of tracking animals, or simply finding out what animals are in an area and how long ago they were there by looking at certain things within the landscape that an animal may have left behind. So the first thing that I like to look for when tracking an animal are its footprints. There's a lot you can tell by finding an animal's footprints and knowing how to read them. You can know what animal was there, how long ago it passed through, what direction it was going when it did pass through. Again, there's just a lot you can learn from finding an animal's actual footprints in the ground and being able to read and follow those footprints. The next thing that I like to look for when tracking an animal is their scat or their poop. Now this may sound a little bit weird looking for animal scat to then go photograph that animal, but there is actually so much that you can learn when you're able to find and identify some animal scat. Some of the things that you can learn is what animal left it there, what they're eating, and how long ago they were eating that food source. If you're able to learn those things from identifying animal scat, you're able to then go look for that food source in whatever area you're in. And if you're looking for that animal, you know that they're eating that food source, you can plant yourself there and hope that they come through during next meal time. So there is just so much that we can learn from animal scat, as weird as that sounds. The third thing that I like to look for when tracking animals are actual pieces of that animal. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about fur, hair, and feathers. For instance, if I'm looking for great gray owls in the forest and I see feathers stuck on tree branches, I know that there was an owl roosted there recently, probably preening or cleaning out its feathers. Some of them came out and got stuck on the branch, and it tells me that there is indeed an owl out there for me to find and photograph. Similarly, if I'm making my way through a forest game trail and I find hair stuck on a tree branch, hopefully I'm able to identify that hair. And if it's some species that I'm hoping to photograph, I can find an area along that game trail for me to hide with my camouflage blind or a ghillie net and hopefully photograph that animal. There's just so much that we can learn from being able to track animals, and there are so many resources out there that we can use to learn more about tracking. But honestly, in my opinion, the best way to learn more is to get out and just do it. The last method for finding wildlife that I wanted to talk about today is by far my favorite way to find wildlife to photograph. But in my opinion, it's also the most time-intensive way, but it's worth it in the long run, so stick with me. This is a method that I have covered in previous videos before, so if you're more interested in this, go check those videos out. I'll put links to them in the description below. I go into much more detail in those videos than I will here today. I'm just going to give you a brief overview. And this way of finding wildlife that I'm talking about is by observing animals, recording their behavior in a wildlife journal, and then using that information that you record to find additional animals within that species in the future. Last year, I did a video with a family of minks. This was such an amazing series of encounters that I had with this family. And in that video, I take you along with me and go step by step throughout this process of how I found them and this method of finding wildlife that I talk about. Before I was able to find this family of minks, I had a chance encounter with a lone mink. And over the series of a couple days, I was able to observe this mink and record information like what time of day it was most active, what type of area within a specific habitat it was fishing the most, it was hunting the most. I was able to identify what types of dens it liked to use the most. And after I compiled all of this information, I went through some other animal books that I had talking about minks, and I read about even more information about them. I used all this information to then go out to a different area, and fairly quickly, using this information, I was able to find another mink that led me back to her den, and I saw this beautiful family of minks that I was able to photograph over the series of a couple of days. And this is just one example in many that I've been able to observe a species, record information about that species, research more information about that species, and then go out to an area that I feel like is ideal for that species and find those animals to then photograph them. It is, again, in my opinion, the most time-intensive way of finding wildlife, but it is also the most effective way, in my opinion, of finding wildlife to photograph. If you have any questions whatsoever about this method, let me know. Go check out those other videos that I referred to, and hopefully you can get some answers to your questions there. I've got a little friend here today, this dog. It's not my dog, but he's been coming along with me on the trail here today. I found him out here and he's been fun to hike with. Not a great way to find wildlife having a dog with you, but it's okay. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's video. It's something that I've wanted to talk about. Come up here. Come here. Come here. It's something that I wanted to talk about for quite a while now, finding wildlife to photograph. It is one of the most difficult ways of, or one of the most difficult things in wildlife photography. So I hope this video has been helpful. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's video. And I think I'm gonna keep hiking now. You know, I'm not a huge dog guy, but this guy has been fun to hike with. So I'm gonna keep going now. And we'll see you next week. Thanks for following along. I always appreciate the support. We'll see you next time. Let's go. Let's go hike. Let's go. Come on. Let's go.